Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 131. And this episode, we wanted to talk about the games between the games, within the games, bestride the games. Whatever preposition you want for games amongst games, we want to talk about minigames today.
Yeah, and not just your Mario parties of the world. We'll talk about that in the next episode, but for this...
Yeah, games that are composed of other smaller games, that's its own thing.
Yeah, this we want to talk about something that I feel like JRPGs brought to the forefront, and then other games followed suit, but like the Gwents of the world, if you're a Witcher fan, right? These games that start out as little games within the game as another way to pass time. And the earliest memory I have of this stuff, although I'm sure it was before, was Chrono Trigger, a game that, you know, we mention all too often on this podcast, but like all of the carnival games within the Millennial Fair it's all mini games, you know, the test of strength, the guessing which character is which, all of that stuff are little mini games. Gato is a battle mini game.
Yeah. You learn battling. It's a tutorial mini game.
Yeah.
I think the earliest for me, certainly for RPGs, is the original Final Fantasy.
Sure.
Where as soon as you get the ship in the second town, you take it out onto the ocean, and what's the button combination? It's something ridiculous, like hold A, press B 55 times, something like that.
Yeah.
And what you get is one of those slide puzzles, the like 4x4, but you got to match 1 through 15.
Mm-hmm.
And other releases of Final Fantasy have given you rewards for that. Like every time you complete it, you get a certain amount of gil, or you can time yourself, and if you beat your record, you get a better item, and people have exploited this in speedruns. But if you beat it the first time in the NES version, and only the first time, again, you just reminded me of this. I don't have notes on this. It's off the top of my head. I think you get like 500 gold, and that's it. You get some gold, but
right.
not never worry about money again gold, and only the first time. And it's just such a thing of who is going to accidentally, that is your cat fell asleep on the NES controllers level of accidentally discovering this minigame. So sort of the opposite of the Millennial Fair, I guess.
Yeah.
And thank you, Squaresoft.
Well, and it's funny, like mini games exist in many different forms, whether they're complete departures from the game you're playing or within the mechanics of the game. Like I'm often reminded of the break the car mini game in the early days of the Street Fighter franchise, where you just pummel a car till it falls apart. Like still uses the mechanics of the fighting game, but you're not fighting another opponent. You're breaking something and hitting it in the right places till it breaks down. And I think what's interesting about mini games when they're put in different kinds of games is that they are executed different ways, and there's no real right way to do it or rule, like because it's a departure in every way from the main thesis, I guess, of the game. And so it's always interesting to see how wild some of those choices are when mini games are put in games.
Right. And I think also the Street Fighter oh my car kind of thing brings up an interesting definition quibble. Is that a mini game or is that a bonus game? And does a bonus game are all mini games bonus games? Are all bonus games mini games? Is there a definition therein? And I'm not saying we need to come down hard on definition. Something I love about doing these episodes is starting that debate and just like letting it go.
Well, yeah, and you bring up a good point because like the Sonic games all have bonus stages.
I wouldn't call those mini games though.
Right, because they are core to the progression of the game, and they are allowing you to get something that helps the progression of the game, I guess.
Yeah, it's less a minigame and more a temporary gameplay shift.
Yeah.
Where, thinking of a game that I just recently completed, Stray, which was utterly delightful. But there are moments in the game where almost an entire chapter is an entirely different style of gameplay. And not just a thing of like, oh, you're a little more stealthy here or you're finding different things. One part could charitably be called a shooter.
Yeah.
Minor spoilers there, apologies. And I didn't play like that at any other point in the game or any point after.
Right.
But I wouldn't call it a mini game, even though it was part of progression. Whereas I suppose a lot of things, to go back to RPGs for a moment, moments in things like Final Fantasy VII, where in order to get out of Midgar, you are riding on a motorcycle and slashing away guards that are getting at you and your party, which determines your hit points when you fight the final boss before leaving Midgar. Or when you do a snowboarding minigame at the beginning of Disc 2 of the PS1 version. And I guess I think of those as mini games rather than gameplay shifts. A, because it's an RPG, and you're right, Matt, it is sort of part and parcel to let's break up the random battles with some other interesting things. And because Final Fantasy VII has Gold Saucer,
Right.
a location that is essentially a Disney World Atlantic City casino. And when you complete any of these sort of mini games in Final Fantasy VII, they become unlockable and playable in Gold Saucer. You can play them again.
Yeah.
And you don't have to like do chapter select or anything at any point in your game. You can just go and snowboard. You can go and ride the motorcycle. You can go and be in a submarine, amongst other more carnival-style minigames. There's Mog House. There's that rock, paper, scissors fighting game that is utterly rigged and all those other things. So I guess a little bit of context on that as well. And true, once you complete Stray, you can do chapter select. So if you want to treat it like a repeatable minigame, sure. But I don't think it is.
Well, yeah, I think it's different when games change up the gameplay versus it being a minigame. I think if Final Fantasy VII had had those moments, but there was no minigame in the Gold Saucer version, I'd lean more towards it just being changing up the style. But because there are clearly ways to replay them over and over again, I think that's part of what makes a minigame. And I agree with your kind of characterization. I think also the length of the game doesn't, like a minigame doesn't have to be small on time necessarily or only able to play one way. Like I think of continuing to talk about JRPGs, all of the card games that are in the Final Fantasy games, and then even in Gwent in The Witcher and the King of Cards minigame in King of Cards, like the Shovel Knight. Yeah. Like all of those are, I would say, are mini games, but they are wholly their own game. Like because there is a mobile version of Gwent that you can play on its own. There have been Gwent releases, I believe, on PC as well. You can just run around King of Cards just playing the card game. But I would argue that that's because it's not the main focus of those games, even though it's changing up the gameplay because it's such a departure, I feel like it's still considered a mini game, but a repeatable mini game and a mini game with like growth.
Absolutely, yeah. It's almost its own sub-quest or subsystem within it. And I think that also is part of why things that could be called mini games are more easily called that in RPGs, because you already have your field map, how you walk around, versus your battle map. There's already a shift in perspective, part and parcel with how people think about JRPGs, and certainly classic JRPGs. So to have something that it's, all right, now we're looking at a cardboard, okay, a board where cards are played, that is to say. Or now we're on a snowboard, or now we are underwater throwing a ball, and whatever it is, it's already like, okay, this is its own scene and thing. And so we've already found the parenthetical cutoff points.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely, these things can become a huge part of the game. I'm always happy to bring up Final Fantasy as examples. Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX are great case studies in similar idea and vastly different execution because they both had card games as mini games and sort of subsystems. Final Fantasy VIII had Triple Triad, which, like it or hate it, shut up, it's great. This was, I believe I've gone on record on this show talking about playing Final Fantasy VIII with my partner, with Sarah, and knowing that Final Fantasy VIII was a game that I'd have to thread the needle a little bit for her. She could really like it, but I have to, God, this feels so manipulative. It's not like I have to emphasize certain systems and be like, okay, we can divide and conquer, I'll handle the junction system. Just know how it works. And here's some other things to do, and here's some other things you like. And I knew Triple Triad was going to be the make or break. The second or third game when she finally, like, it clicked for her. Mm-hmm. And there was such a distinct, oh no, I need all these cards. I'm going to challenge everybody. Is everything going to explode? Time for a card game now. Kind of thing. And that's exactly what it was. And I finally learned how to properly abolish rules because the random rule, the plus rule. Yeah. Regardless, if you've never played Triple Triad, be thankful you don't have flashbacks to those things. Yeah. But also, you learned commands that you could assign to your characters to turn creatures you fight into cards to add to your deck. You could turn cards into items into, well, you couldn't turn items into cards, but there was a whole thing where you could engage with it or not, but it could be weaved into the main gameplay. And I don't think you were ever required to play a single game of Triple Triad, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Final Fantasy IX had Tetramaster, where the rules were I finally found out random.
Yeah, there are no like through line rules. Tetramaster made me almost quit Final Fantasy IX because there are moments where they do require. It's only a couple, but like in the early days,
There's one tournament
you have to play in and you have to win.
That's right. Yeah, the Oglot Master and the
and it's just frustrating. It just also doesn't feel like the rules were laid out as well as Triple Triad were.
No, they weren't. And Sarah and I played Final Fantasy IX before 8. And so it was just kind of, when we got to the cards in 8 being like, no, please. It's going to make so much more sense. Yeah. Because we looked up the rules to Tetramaster so many times, and y'all can mock me as much as you want for taking a long time to figure it out, but it's a little convoluted. And finally getting to the point of, no, but seriously, what these numbers mean is they are a range of numbers. And so you have a higher chance of beating these cards, but you're not necessarily going to. There's sort of a roll of the dice. Like, why do these numbers pop up? Well, because it's within the range. So it's random. Well, so having more powerful cards is still just random. Yeah. Okay, cool. Now I know. Now I don't care.
Yeah. Yeah, I was known to not really play those card games much. I haven't replayed 8 since I beat it in the PlayStation era. I considered buying the Switch version because I enjoyed 9's Switch version so much. And because like they've added little mods to the recent modern ports where like you can speed up battle, you can skip battles, you can like boost your health and damage, so you can insta-kill stuff, like allowing you to really just see the story if you want, which I think is really great and more games should have. But like, I don't know. I tried to get into Tetramaster and I couldn't. And once I let it go and just said, all right, this is a thing I'm not going to do, the game was way more enjoyable. And 9 has become one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, you got to know when to fold them.
Yeah.
And I love card video games. I'm not incredible at them, but I love them so much.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was deeply upsetting to me back then and as now that like something like Tetramaster, I had to walk away. I have not really gotten into the Witcher series, so Gwent is one of those things that is a future hyperfixation of mine. Yes. I know I'm going to be obsessed with it when I play The Witcher. But for now, I'm happy everyone else is happy.
Yeah, and like we'll eventually do an episode on card games on the Broad because I think there's a lot to talk about.
Agreed.
Also, obviously, we can't talk about the subject without mentioning Inscription, one of the best games in the recent years. But like people liked the point of Inscription, without really spoiling anything, is that there is a larger narrative centered around this like dungeon crawl card game that you're playing, this roguelike card game. People liked the roguelike card game part of it so much, even though that's not the main focus, although it's how you progress, that they released like a version of it that is just the card game, that you can just play the card game, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, and that also makes a fun argument of, is something that is the scaffolding upon which the main game is built around, even though it's larger than the main game, is it still a mini game?
Yeah.
Like that it wouldn't be, but it is interesting to see those games that become their own structure. A non-card game that is a little more easily called a minigame that became its own thing was Geometry Wars.
Yeah.
That was I first knew it as the standalone Xbox 360 minigame, playing it at my friend Sean's house. You know, playing that, loving it. I still play it every now and again. Not on my 360, but because I don't have one anymore. But in other means, because it's still out there. It's on the Wii. But it started as an arcade cabinet in your garage in Project Gotham Racing 2.
Yep.
And I do love those strange meta of when video games put arcade games in their games. Sometimes it's to play a classic game. Sometimes it's to play something completely made up. Geometry Wars is its own thing. Probably the main redeeming factor of PlayStation 1's Contra Legacy of War is the fact that in the second level, there's a little just off the beaten path, like in the jungle level, there's a little jungle hut that has 2 arcade cabinets in it. And I actually don't know if those are classic Konami games or anything, but it's like a Tempest-style shooter and like a kind of top-down maze tank game. And I've played those. I've put far more hours into that than I've ever put into Contra Legacy of War, the main game. And I think that's for the best.
Yeah, it's funny. I love a lot of things about the Yakuza franchise, but one of my favorite things is that I think since the originals, but for sure the remakes and the modern ones, all have arcades where you can play claw machines and a bunch of other stuff. And they have Virtual Fighter and like all of these other Sega classic games that you can just play in those arcades. You can play a full version, I believe, of Virtual Fighter 2 in one of the Yakuza games. Like it's literally you just have a port of Virtual Fighter 2.
That's incredible.
Which is not a mini game. It's a whole ass other game, but it feels like it within this other game. But that said, talking about the Yakuza franchise, they are one of the more famous franchises to have mini games and a huge variety of them. I mean, not only do they have a ton of sub-stories that are just stories off the beaten path, often comical, often fun, but you can do karaoke in most of the modern games, which becomes a rhythm game. You can play claw machine.
Like dance party stuff.
There's a photo mini game, which is like taking sexy photos. And like, it's so funny how many they put into it. And then, of course, more famously, our friend of the show, Derek Van Dyke, who in his Yakuza 0 side quest talks about how he just wants the cabaret minigame to be its own game. Because just about every modern Yakuza game has had that cabaret minigame where you can just run a cabaret club. You pick which girls, talk to which patrons, you bring drinks, you offer gifts, and it becomes its own game. And it's super engrossing. And like, that's what I think is really interesting about mini games within larger games is, especially in the modern era, because you can fit so much on these discs or on these hard drives, since a lot of games don't use discs anymore.
Yeah.
You can just pack so much other stuff. And like Yakuza doesn't need those mini games. I often don't play all of them, but it's so cool that they're there. And if you want to dig through all that stuff, you get rewards, you get quest items, you get stuff within the game, weapons, whatever else. And I think that's really interesting in the modern sense. Like we can pack so much into a game that you can put other games within your games.
Yeah. Yo, dog, I heard you like games.
Yeah.
To use an old meme. And I mean, also, Yakuza has a bit of the Shenmue DNA going on, where there was also, wasn't Shenmue the one where there was a secret duck racing whole side quest you could do?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and no, I agree. There's something very interesting about how you can fit entire small worlds or like small stand on their own games within these larger games. When we were a few episodes ago talking about analysis paralysis within open world games and the fact that, yeah, the open world concept is sort of the du jour of the AAA studios at the moment. You have a lot of different teams making a lot of different things, and it's almost as if, is this a large AAA title, or is this 6 really good games disguised as mini games in a trench coat?
Yeah.
All standing on top of each other. And then you have that stuff where you get like Virtua Fighter in the middle of the larger game. It's almost a recursive mini game. I was going to ask at one point, do we consider the NES ROMs that you can unlock in Animal Crossing, do we consider those mini games? Is Balloon Fight now just a mini game? It's the same idea as that first boss you fought in a game that was so difficult is now just a regular enemy in the final castle.
Yeah.
But they're still important, and I guess, are they mini games? Are they not? It's a very funny thing. I think of something that was an original game that I do think of as a mini game is Galaga being used as a loading mini game for the original Tekken on the PS1.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of my knowledge here is the PS1, but there's a lot of mini games. And ones that are very much mini games and not just systems in an open world, which are still mini games. Right. But in the original Tekken, while it's loading up the game, you start playing Galaga. And at whatever point that the game is loaded, you then have the option to press a button and move on to the game. Or you could just keep playing Galaga.
Yeah.
What's funny is I don't think they tell you in-game at all on this. But if you reach a certain level in Galaga, if you get to a certain point, you unlock a character. Or not quite a character. You unlock the sort of proto-devil for Kazuya.
Mm-hmm.
Kazuya. You give him like his devil-ish look. But you only get that if you get to like level 30 in Galaga. So I definitely got pretty decent at Galaga way back when. But also the concept of the game is loading, so here's something small and super easy to load up to play in the meantime is something that really should happen more, except Namco had a patent on loading screen games for I think like 20 years or something like that. It's only recently expired, but we're so past that point, I guess.
Yeah, things load pretty quick now.
Yeah, that not everyone's thinking to do it. But I mean, sometimes loading takes a while.
Yeah.
Whether it's the initial load. Depends on the console, or it's the initial install or something else. And if you're excited to play this new game that came out and you now need to wait 45 minutes for them to install everything, I'm not going to be entitled and go, the least you can do is, but the least you could do is put like a little dinky arcade game in there. It could be something from your history or something you threw together that's a lawyer-friendly version of a classic game, but it's something goofy to play with. How often did you end up just watching Mario hit the coins while you were downloading eShop games? Just something a little fun and entertaining, because minigames are a distraction, and that doesn't quite cover how important they are. Because it's good to have a distraction sometimes. It's good to, in a tens of hours game, break up gameplay to, after really heavy moments, kind of lift things a little, or to remind you how a game is played or anything like that. There's tons of reasons why a light distraction is actually exactly what you need.
For sure. And before we move too far past the RPGs with games within them, I do want to talk about a game that we both love, Eastward, that had a whole ass other RPG within the game.
Yes, exactly.
It had Earthborn, it's called, and you got these little, essentially, amiibo to use to unlock stuff in the game. And, like, there's a final boss, a whole story. Like, Sam often talks about Earthborn because she's obsessed with it. But I don't know that I would call that a minigame, because it's a pretty fleshed out, like, it's old school RPG, but it's like a kind of 8-bit RPG within this game. And I think it's really fascinating when games are still doing that now, when the game would have been perfectly effective without Earthborn, but they
had
even
its own soundtrack composed by a completely different person. We know this. We talked to Joel.
Yeah, it's wild to me. And so I think it's really fascinating when games do that. I think also, though, we can't really talk about minigames and minigames going on to become their own games without talking about the king of minigames, Kirby, the Pink Puff. Because from pretty much day one, I think they weren't in the original Kirby's Dream Land, but since Kirby's Adventure and beyond, there have been mini games in every Kirby game. Claw machines.
There's the egg catcher stuff. There was the Megaton Punch. There's all sorts of things.
Yeah. And it's just wild that then they would just keep ramping that up, adding other mini games. The more modern titles had even more involved mini games. And then those mini games, like Clash and a few others, became their own eShop-based kind of mobile game style full-fledged games where you build your own characters, you buy gems, whatever else. And like, it's really interesting to me when things do that. It's like we talked about a little bit before with Gwent, like you could just leave these mini games within the game, but sometimes they go on and just become their own games, and when they're not mini games anymore.
Yeah, and depending upon what purpose the game serves, I mean, Kirby from the outset, Kirby's Dream Land was sort of designed to be the, not quite an entry-level game, but one that was very much designed for the Game Boy, for handheld gaming, for short gameplay bursts.
Yeah.
Which then lends itself well to a character who is versatile and can copy powers and do all sorts of other things. And when you think of Kirby as a ball, Kirby as a rock, Kirby as a rocket ship, Kirby is whatever it is, you can then put Kirby, a very marketable, delightful character that we have spoken of at length, into other short experiences and build those up. It's still very much in the spirit of Kirby to have long adventures, short adventures, wild distractions, or what have you. And so, yeah, you're right. Kirby is definitely up in the upper echelons of minigame royalty.
I will say also on the record, so Geoff doesn't have to go looking for them, you may hear an errant squeak or two. My adorable dog son, Otis, is out of his crate and now playing with a chew toy. So
he's doing just fine.
He's doing just fine. But yeah, no, and I think also we should talk about probably one of the kings of mini game styles before we go too far. That
is it fishing?
So it wasn't fishing, but fishing is one of them. But I'd say the two kings then, fishing and racing, because I feel like every good platformer or adventure game has those. Think about Zelda specifically. Mm-hmm. Zelda often has a fishing mini game and some kind of racing mini game with Epona. Mm-hmm. But like even as early as Mario 64, when you race the Koopa Troopa to get a star, like that, you do that twice in that game, and that's
Chrono
it.
Trigger has a racing mini game.
Yeah, where you can race all of the costumed guests in the fair. And then the one later on where you race against Johnny in a vehicle. Yeah, and I think those are too many games that are completely ubiquitous when it comes to video games as a whole. I mean, I remember absolutely wanting to snap my controller in half trying to do the fishing game in Twilight Princess. It's not a hard mini game, but if you're not paying attention or if you don't really follow the instruction, it can be very hard to accomplish, and they literally stop you from progressing in the game until you catch a fish. And I almost threw my GameCube out the window.
That is the frustrating one, given the fact that fishing minigames are in so many different kinds of adventures and different kinds of games. I know that I am fairly certain some of that is cultural within Japan.
Right.
For those games. I do love the fact that in Final Fantasy 15, fishing is such an integral part of Noctis that amongst the crystal where he stores the royal armory is also where he stores his fishing pole. So the same animation of like holding his arm out and the cool weapon appears in a burst of blue, a fishing pole can happen too. Like making fishing epic. Great job, Prince.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly. But fishing minigames never quite caught me.
Yeah.
No pun intended. That just came out. But I think racing minigames, one of the reasons that works is races by their nature are quick. You're not going to do a marathon. And at their core, racing games are like so many other kinds of elemental motions of arcade action. Whether you want to think of it as steering or evading or maneuvering or whatever it is, you do that in platformers. You do that in shoot 'em ups. You do whatever that is. And so it's a managing of your resource and a managing of your maneuverability. And yeah, there's plenty of racing games where you can go real deep onto that kind of a thing. This understates it, but it doesn't take much to take what you have and just kind of give it a little bit of fast twitch gameplay for a few minutes. Yeah. And I guess fishing minigames are kind of the opposite. Whereas there's like quick runs, this is patience.
Yeah.
This is think and wait and find with some intense moments there as you try to reel things in. And that's another kind of management and aim and maneuverability. But it is interesting that, yeah, we accidentally kind of found the opposite ends of mini-game franticness, I guess, where the race is quick. 3, 2, 1, go. And it's only a few laps or however long. Whereas fishing, you can take as long as you want. A single round of fishing can take a long time. You just have to wait for it and contemplate a little. And those are two different kinds of distractions to be had amongst a larger experience. I suppose fishing works in Legend of Zelda because so much of Legend of Zelda is go, climb, jump, explore, fight, use. Whereas fishing is you are here. Do this here.
Yeah.
It's contrast.
And I think like mini games have led to the creation of larger games, which we'll talk about in the next episode. And I think we should keep fishing in mind when we talk about farming sims, which are effectively a collection of mini games. I mean, the reason I like Stardew Valley as opposed to a lot of other sims of a similar nature is because the fishing is actually fun there. Like I feel like I can do it well, and it is effectively a tiny little mini game within that game. But even like talking about other things that you do in those kinds of games, we should talk about cooking. We did a whole episode with Rev Valentine about cooking, but cooking is effectively a mini game within games too, especially if you look at Breath of the Wild or even Eastward we just mentioned before. It's what things can I combine? How do I, like there's strategy to it. And effectively, it's just to make a thing that you can then gobble down in 10 seconds and get all your health back. But like, it is interesting that there is no one way to make a mini game within these kinds of RPGs and action adventure games. There are some that are often similar, but they all have their own little spin on it.
Yeah. Well, I also think of, as a off the beaten path on that one, is how the Nintendo DS and 3DS begat a lot of mini games because of the touchscreen. It allowed for a different mode of control, whether that is find and point and click, or it's motions that are drawn on the screen. And you mentioned cooking, and I immediately thought of making puffins in Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, which was, yes, choose your ingredients, put them together, put them in the pot, and then you gotta stir, buddy. Like, don't stir too fast or it'll go out, but don't stop stirring or it's gonna scorch. And you gotta maintain this. And it took me a while to get that right. I was an adult at that point, practically. It took me a while to get the hang of making puffins, but it's still just like stir like crazy, which I guess is a motion that happens when you cook sometimes. I've done that, but like fishing, like racing. I guess it is the active version of a crafting system.
Yeah.
When you get down to it.
Totally. And like, I mean, there have been cooking mini games that I've hated, like the Kingdom Hearts 3 cooking experience. And like,
Oh, yeah.
it seemed like a good idea, right? Like, you have Ratatouille, you have Remy. Like, it makes sense, but I hated it. I just hated it. But that said, I think that's the thing about mini games, right? You're either going to love them or hate them. It's rare that people are just kind of like, yeah, they're fine. Because 9 times out of 10, they detract from the main thing. Like, that's the point of mini games within games. Like you said, they're a distraction, which isn't a bad thing. It's distraction non-derogatory, right? This idea of like it diverts from the main thing to give you another thing to do. Are they necessary? Arguable. You can't really, like, I don't think there's a right answer there, but they are definitely by design a thing for off the beaten path. And so whenever you're playing a mini game within a game, if it's not something you like, it will always feel like an inconvenience. Bad mini games, badly designed mini games, or mini games you just don't like because they're not your taste, they will always upset you. They will always make a video game experience more frustrating.
Yeah, and I suppose it's the thing of mini games by their very nature aren't necessary, but they can be necessary within a larger narrative depending upon what you do with them or how long they take or what it is. If they are a shift in gameplay and you can't move on unless you complete it, I think is one of the things that is bothersome. Things like Gwent, I don't think you are required to win a hand of Gwent in order to progress in The Witcher.
No, not that I recall. I think they make you play a game of Gwent early in Witcher 3. But I don't think it's part of the main story. I think it's a side quest and that like gets you on the path to start playing Gwent more regularly.
Like I also think of, I obliquely referenced Blitzball earlier, but I feel that's another one that is a mini game that can enrich the larger game. You get Waka's limit breaks through playing Blitzball. You are forced to play a single round of Blitzball. You do not have to win. The game moves on. It doesn't have far-reaching consequences unless you are obsessive about the sphere grid. And I know that it's not a small part of the gaming population, but still, that's the only thing, really, and your own pride.
Yeah.
And so, to, again, talk about my Final Fantasy journey with Sarah, playing through 10, loved 10, 10's great. We played that one game of Blitzball, and Sarah just kind of went, this is sports. I don't want this.
Yeah.
I think that those were her exact words. And it's its own system, whereas one of my friends loves Blitzball. And when we played Final Fantasy X together in college, it was like, oh my God, we get to do Blitzball now. And because you don't have to engage with it any more than, it never impedes your progress, how you're doing at Blitzball. It can only help you. That is a great use of a minigame like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's also a fun little reward for perseverance or for exploring every nook and cranny of things. I'm thinking of, in the same way that Slide 15 puzzle shows up in the original Final Fantasy on the Famicom NES, there's also, I was shocked to discover in Full Throttle, I was a huge fan of LucasArts point-and-click games when I was a kid.
Right.
They were on Mac, so it was something for me to do. And in Full Throttle, there is, at one of the early locations that you return to, this biker bar, there's a trucker there that you need to help smuggle you through a blockade. And he is sitting at the table doing 5-finger fillet, hands splayed out, doing the knife, like getting between his fingers, going as fast as he can. And like periodically he'll get his hand and he shakes it and everything. And amongst the dialogue options, you can be like, let me show you how to do that. And he's like, not going to happen. And that is how he says it, and it's the same clip every time. If you keep asking him, and not a small amount of times, it's like 30, 40 times, he finally like sticks the knife on the table. Fine, let's see what you can do. And you get a screen that you don't see anywhere else. You get a whole thing, you get like rock, like metal music is playing, and you like have to like click between your fingers and do it, and he will taunt you the whole time, and there's no benefit to it. You don't earn anything. You don't get a secret item that makes some puzzle easier. There's nothing of that. You've just annoyed an annoying trucker, voiced by Mark Hamill. You've just annoyed a trucker enough to be like, fine, do it. Here's a mini game. Doesn't impede your progress, doesn't even benefit your progress. But every now and then, I do enjoy when a game puts something completely inane behind incessant annoyance like that on the player's part.
Yes, yes. But yeah, and I agree with all of that. I think that ultimately mini games are at their strongest when they don't impede progress and when they don't require you to do them, because the minute you require it, it's not a mini game, it's a game mechanic, right?
Yeah.
If it's required for progression. Or like I like ones that aren't required in the beginning, but then later on a section of the game could be required for them. Like the whole mini games within the Millennial Fair get you ready for when you want to do a thing that I guess I won't spoil.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
No, but there's several things within the Millennial Fair that absolutely get you ready for future parts of the game, one way or another.
Yeah, and like I think that those are the most brilliant ways to use mini games. I think about all the ways that Mario games have like incorporated mini games as bonus stages as well, you know. And like there's a fine line between bonus stages and mini games, cuz like think about Blue Sphere. Blue Sphere is absolutely a bonus stage within the Sonic games. But there is also a whole separate Blue Sphere game you can play if you put Sonic 1 on Sonic and Knuckles back in the day, and then was later released as just part of collections. And it's like 100 levels of Blue Sphere that are all different.
Yeah.
At least. So like at that point, I would consider that a minigame collection, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of interesting how these things kind of ebb and flow and there's no hard fact. But I like that when we get the really good minigames that are fun and then they get to become their own thing, they're really easy to build off of. I think what makes most mini games to their core inherently good also is that they are often simple. Not simple to master, but definitely simple to grok, to get the hang of initially. The controls are pretty straightforward and simple, and then they ramp them up by overcomplicating the controls later, building up to a challenge, but they have like a basic level, and I think it's why Tetramaster fails at all, is because there's no simplicity to even that first match, whereas Triple Triad and even the King of Cards game, they build up to the more complicated mechanics.
Yeah.
Tetramaster just kind of feels convoluted from the beginning.
Or the very core is, oh, this is nice, this is simple. I could go with this. I don't know how long it's going to be interesting. We've added a new layer. And you can, and even messing with those layers are their own things. And I did want to mention another kind of minigame setup that was from another game that I recently played. It Takes Two, which is a game about a couple on the verge of divorce. Like they are planning on it. They need to sign the papers, all that stuff. And their daughter turns them into dolls accidentally. So they are going through all sorts of, it's sort of like the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids of everything in their daughter's world becoming real and huge and everything else. And going through their relationship and going through their history and all of this stuff. And it's kind of, it's a very fun game. I loved it. And there's throughout little mini games that aren't even here's a new screen and you're doing this thing. It's one of your characters will be like, oh my gosh, come check this out. They're almost like little board games or little arcadey moments that happen that you get nothing for them. They are not crucial to progression in the game. But I feel that they are great for their mini games in world, which is so funny.
Right.
And I think they're great for both world building and kind of the thesis of the game, like the sort of the relationship building. And relationship just becomes a very funny word if you've played It Takes Two. And there's a little bit of like fun back and forth that the characters have with each other while you play that. There's never malicious taunting or gloating, but there is gloating when one wins or doesn't. And to play that with your partner is a great deal of fun in that way, to then have like this is just kind of, because it's a game that requires two players. Yeah. It Takes Two. And so I enjoyed how all of those just slightly to the side mini games throughout that, again, don't really come through in a sense of here are your high scores, here's whatever. And you can play them as many times as you want. And they never show up in a thing where you're like on the run. You're kind of exploring and, oh, I found this game. Oh, here's a shooting gallery. Here's a racing game. Here's a whatever. You play it a little bit. You play it as long as you want. And you kind of josh and goof at each other, and off you go. And again, back to what you were saying, Matt, what we were figuring out, that like when it doesn't impede your progress, mini games can be very enriching and be very fun. And even when they're not a system weaved into the progression of the game, they still can be part of the building within the game.
Yeah, I mean, the better mini games build the narrative too, right? They don't just have to be fun. It's like your very first example, the motorcycle chase and the snowboarding stuff from Final Fantasy VII built out the feeling of that narrative. That chase, that escaping Midgar is so hectic. I hear the motorcycle music in my head as I talk about it. And like, it's so hectic and feels so different than when you switch to the minigame version of it. It's still the same game, but there's less drama and more, fun. I can just play this again.
Well, and it also builds on the FMV that plays before that when they're all hopping in the car and Cloud is riding the motorcycle down the stairs out of the Shinra building and they break the glass going out of the building and they're hitting the highway and everything. If it was just regular field control, it wouldn't feel the same. And there was already chases that went on the field map in Midgar in Final Fantasy VII. But to go from that and transition into that minigame, it felt more real to the game than if it was just regular controls.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately what I love most about minigames when they're done right is that they build the entire experience. Like, there's not a doubt in my mind that King of Cards from the folks over at Yacht Club was like, let's make a card game. Like, I'm sure that was early in the development process. There was no way that they were just like, oh, and I guess we'll throw in a card game, because those folks just seem like the type. But that said, it is weaved into the narrative in a brilliant way and also not required on any level. But like, as you play more of it, and I hated it at the beginning and then of course became obsessed with it by the end, there's some really cool story moments that happen as a result of that game and the people you meet and the characters you interact with. And I just think that making games feel immersive, mini games can go a long way to do that, because mini games are often not the player playing the mini game, but the player playing the character playing the mini game.
Absolutely.
Right? When you're fishing, you're not fishing, you're making Link fish. So Link is doing the thing, So it's like a couple steps removed even from just the player playing the game. It's the player playing the character playing the game.
Yeah,
which I think just adds more to honing the experience.
Yeah, the conversations you have as King Knight in King of Cards while playing cards and with those people help build out that character. They sort of play out the adorably sad dandy that he is. Yeah. And you have those sorts of conversations in building as Shovel Knight, as Plague Knight, as Spectre Knight. And this is King Knight's. His kingdom, his world is cards while dreaming of bigger things. And you only have to play once or twice. And other than that, like you can get just as into these cards as King Knight is.
Yep.
Does that say good things about you? I don't care. I like card games.
I'm curious, Geoff, this whole conversation about mini games, do you have a particularly favorite one that stands out to you? I feel like we've talked about a lot of different ones, and I don't know that immediately comes to mind one that I'm like, this is my favorite.
I would put Triple Triad up there. I do want to honorable mention a different mini game because it's truly is the best part of a game.
Okay.
And it was the loading mini game from Fantastic Four, again for the PS1, which had a Micro Machines style top-down racing game that could have up to 4 players because Fantastic Four used the multi-tap. And Fantastic Four is an utterly forgettable, at best, 3D beat-em-up from the PS1. Ooh, it's bad. But that minigame was a lot of fun. We had a lot more laughs and joy playing through that. But I think as far as minigames go, I might have to go with Triple Triad on this one. If I remember one later, I will remember one later. But the music was incredible. The little clap at the beginning, though, that goes on is forever in my and Sarah's head. I do love card games. I love collection quests. It was such a wonderfully realized game. A card game that you can't play IRL to its full extent no matter how hard you try because of the way the board works.
Right.
Which I like. And how it all works together and integrates with the system. It just pleases my stat JRPG loving part of my heart. So yeah, I think Triple Triad is probably my favorite. What about you, Matt?
So, I mean, I have a few. I think one of them, which we didn't even mention in particular specifically, but there was a dual mini game that I think started in Kirby's Adventure.
It did.
And then went on to be in a bunch of other games where you're Kirby with this like shinobi style ponytail. And it's literally a quick draw mini game. But the rules are there's a timer. You have to wait till that timer kicks off to start. And then whoever hits the button first after it starts.
And you have a little bit of a moment of silence before that timer starts. And so, when you get to like the third or fourth opponent, jumping the gun is so common.
So common. But I love that. I thought it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that kind of high pressure. I don't know, I could play a whole game of that, but playing it as like an in-between while playing Kirby's Adventure was always a lot of fun. And then, I mean, I think I might have to say the King of Cards card game.
All right.
I like TCGs. I played Magic the Gathering for many years. I still have a bunch of my decks. I've played tons of other ones. I played the World of Warcraft TCG for a while. Like, I liked Hearthstone. I didn't mind Triple Triad. But like, typically, for the most part, I hate card games, video games. Like, and I think part of it was Tetramaster. But like,
yeah, it's real.
It's why I didn't initially play Inscription, is because I was like, oh, card game. Fine. And then I learned more about it and watched one Jesse Vitelli play through like 90% of the game. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Yep.
But like King of Cards does such a good job of making that card game so easy to grok in the beginning and then build system upon system upon system to the point where at the beginning I was like, ugh, this is such a deterrent. Fine, I'll play a couple matches. Towards the end of the game, every time I got to a new town, every time there was a new inn or bar, I literally went to every single person and was like, let's go, let's battle.
Right.
Let's duel. Like I was just into it. And so I think the King of Cards game, the card game within it is just so addictive. And so is easily one of my favorites.
And I guess I will touch on, when you talked about the quick draw for Kirby, I remembered, I think it's only in Kirby's Adventure, the egg catching game.
Yes.
Where they make it so epic, but it's just
so epic.
DDD standing on the top rope in a wrestling ring, throwing eggs and bombs. And you need to hold down A to open your mouth and let go of A to close your mouth, and only eat eggs, don't eat bombs. The minigame ends if you eat a bomb. And depending upon the number of eggs you eat, you get free lives. And if you make it to the end of the minigame not eating any bombs, DDD gets like so upset. And Kirby opens his mouth, and a bunch of little chicks just jump out of his mouth. It's, again, a nice, different kind of gameplay for Kirby, which is something great that minigames can have. They're optional to do that and everything else. And I don't know, something about it. It was something that I grokked from a very young age. And now as an adult where I have a better hang of it, I just really enjoy any opportunity I have to play it.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even talk about like Earthworm Jim had a ton of mini games that were like just different game modes that you could argue were bonus stages, but like the Peter Puppy catching the additional puppies mini game. If you dropped too many, he transformed into the monster form and ate you, which I would often do on purpose because I loved the transformation sequence.
It's fun.
There's just so many. Obviously, we haven't covered them all. Obviously, in the next episode, we are going to talk more about minigame collections, your Mario parties and the like. If there are any games in those franchises that you want us to cover that we may not think of, please hit us up. Also, let us know what your favorite minigames are. There have been so many over the years, from the Nintendo beyond to even now modern day games often have mini games or side quests that are like these one-off mechanics. So let us know what your favorites are.
Yeah, if you think that minigames are great, or if you have quibble with our definition of what is and isn't a minigame. Oh, let's split hairs. Let's split hairs, everybody. Isn't that what gaming's all about? But discussion or what have you. There's so many ways to get in touch with us. You can reach us on Twitter and Instagram at funandgamespod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. You can go to Certain POV and find a permanent invite link to our Discord server, as well as check out not only this show, our other show, Side Quests, and a lot of other fantastic nerdy podcasts.
Yeah. You can also find me and Geoff on Twitter. I am DJ_Stormageddon. Geoff is Geoff Makes Noise. Please interact with us. We love chatting with y'all over on Twitter. That is the best place to reach us and interact with the show. I also want to do a quick shout out and thank you to recent reviews we got in. Every review we get on Apple Podcasts and Spotify helps our discoverability, helps people join this incredible community. We got ones from Muffin Mon, A Gamer Looks at 40, and Real Dave 24. Thank you all for your reviews. We really, really appreciate it. And we absolutely are happy to shout you out on the show if you submit them. So please keep doing that.
Yes, thank you so much. I know for the most part, it's just Matt and me and Matt on the show and the occasional guest, but you're all a part of this and we appreciate hearing from you. We love chatting about all these things with you, whether on Twitter, over email, over Discord, whatever it is, because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Nostalgia is one of the strongest forces in the human psyche and is responsible for the continued existence of some of our favorite fandoms. From the minds behind the Dole Up in Dreams podcast and Isolation Cast Voices from Quarantine, Saturday Morning Confidential takes you on a deep dive into the properties that helped influence the artists and creators of today. So whether you are a Goonie, a Gem Girl, a Digi-Destined, or you just want to return to Oz, new episodes release on Fridays bi-weekly starting January 1st of 2021, and join us on the Wednesdays after the main show for the Serial Killer Radio Hour, where we sit down with the people responsible for the toys, shows, and fandoms that you love. Now you can find Saturday Morning Confidential at certainpov.com/SMCpod or on your favorite podcast platforms. So don't forget to tune in for another deep dive into the files of Saturday Morning Confidential.
CPOV.
certainpov.com.